The First World War, breaking out as it did on August 4, 1914, had a profound effect upon the Royal Arsenal. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And in the case of Woolwich, it would be true to say that the last two factors operated. The ordnance factories reached their maximum both in numbers and output during the years 1914 to 1918, and blossomed into full maturity. Never again were they to scale such heights, not even in the Second World War. After 1918, a decline set in, and though stemmed temporarily between 1936 and 1945, it has continued to operate towards an uncertain future. The administrative organization of Woolwich in 1914 had changed little in essentials since the reorganization of 1888, brought about by the Morley reforms. The member of the Army Council responsible for the ordnance factories was the fourth military member, the Master General of the Ordnance, who controlled them through the Director of Artillery. The supervision exercised by the latter official, however, was confined chiefly to placing orders and issuing instructions from a military point of view, the general management of the factories being left entirely in the hands of the Chief Superintendent of Ordnance Factories. No definite regulations existed concerning the subjects which CSOF had to refer to the Director of Artillery, but broadly speaking they were those affecting pay, personnel, building services, machinery, purchase of material, permanent promotions to the rank of foreman and above, special increases of pay, and increases for particular classes of employees. As a general rule, all schemes for building and extensions of plant were referred to headquarters for sanction. Small purchases of material up to £25 in value, or £100 in cases of buildings, were allowed without War Office approval, with an extension to £100 when urgency demanded. After the outbreak of the war, this figure was raised to £500, monthly reports being submitted to the War Office. In cases of emergency, War Office sanction was obtained after the work had been completed. Manufacturing orders were placed on CSOF by means of extracts, issued by the Deputy Director of Ordnance Stores for the Army, by the Superintendent of Ordnance Stores for the Navy, and by the Inspector, Royal Engineer Stores for the Director of Fortifications and Works. The allocation of orders between government factories and the trade, that is between extracts and contracts, was settled at an allocation meeting consisting of representatives of the War Office and Admiralty. Unless any indication of urgency was attached to an extract, priority of work was left to the discretion of CSOF. When an extract was received by the factories, it authorized the Chief Superintendent to order the necessary material and plant, to engage labor, and to take any other essential steps to manufacture the articles demanded. Raw materials and trade supplies of plant were ordered through the Director of Army Contracts. The Deputy Director of Ordnance Stores, Woolwich, who was responsible for provision, was an officer on the staff of the Director of Equipment and Ordnance Stores, under the orders of the Quartermaster General. He acted under the instruction of the Director of Artillery for the MGO's requirements, and under the orders of QMG. For Vote 8 and other stores. This serving of two masters was a relic of the time when the QMG and the MGO were not separate officials at the War Office. In August 1914, the ordnance factories at Woolwich consisted of the Royal Laboratory, where ammunition of all kinds was made and filled, the Royal Gun and Carriage Factories, which dealt with guns, carriages, mountings, wagons, ammunition boxes and transport of various descriptions, the Mechanical Engineering Department engaged in the general engineering requirements of the whole arsenal, the Building Works Department responsible for buildings, road and railway traffic. Each of these departments was administered by a superintendent, and, in addition, the chief superintendent, who acted as his own chief mechanical engineer, had a military assistant to assist him on technical matters, and a civil assistant to deal with finance, accounts, stores and pay. The Royal Laboratory, the factory which expanded the most during the First World War, underwent some reorganization prior to the war, changes which have already been indicated. In March 1916, it was split into three main divisions, namely the filling factories under a controller, the small arm ammunition factories under a controller, and the East and West Laboratory under a superintendent. The SAA factories dealt with the manufacture of SAA, the East and West Laboratory manufactured empty shell, bombs, primers, tubes, fuses, cartridge cases, etc., while the filling factories carried out all filling operations. The Royal Gun and Carriage Factories continued their pre-war organisation till 1917, when, until the end of the war, the superintendent had under him an assistant superintendent in the gun factory, and a deputy superintendent in the carriage factory. This deputy superintendent had on his staff 2 assistants, one in charge of the woodworking department, and the other under his immediate orders. These were all military officers, and the deputy superintendent, who was a mounting specialist, had a good deal of latitude in control, and in originating carriage design. The superintendent gun and carriage factories was responsible for gun design. When the responsibility for the supply of munitions for the armed forces was taken over on June 9, 1915, by the Ministry of Munitions under the Ministry of Munitions Act, the control of the ordnance factories did not at once pass from the War Office, though it was understood that the whole of the technical resources and experience of the staff should be placed at the disposal of the Ministry for assisting the development of munitions supply. The whole position of the ordnance factories in this twilight period was the subject of much discussion between the War Office and the Ministry of Munitions, the principal object being to secure a smooth transfer without dislocation of work. Since the Ministry of Munitions was regarded as a wartime necessity, to be given an honourable burial when peace once more returned, the transfer was from the first assumed to be purely temporary, and a scheme for a partial transfer was put forward. But it was finally recognised by all that a complete transfer of full administrative control could alone be satisfactory, and this was agreed to in principle by both parties in August 1915. Mr. David Lloyd George, then Minister of Munitions, allocated the control of the ordnance factories to the Director General of Munitions Supply, whom he provided with a consultative committee on management. This committee, which was representative of the War Office, the Admiralty and the chief supply departments of the ministry concerned, became the medium for considering with CSOF matters affecting the placing of large programs and questions of output. Extracts under the new arrangements were to be placed by the ministry, and a section to perform this task. CM was formed under Mr. Eric Geddes, then Deputy Director General of the Munitions Supply Department, to deal with them and with correspondence with the ordnance factories relating to such questions as pay, personnel, extensions, supply of machinery, statistical returns as to output and progress, and the quality and efficiency of production. Sir Frederick Donaldson vacated his appointment in September 1915 to become technical advisor to the ministry, and was succeeded as CSOF by Sir Vincent Raven, who remained in control till June 1917, when he was succeeded by Brigadier General C.P. Martel. Sir Frederick Donaldson did not long survive his change of post. He lost his life at sea on June 5, 1916, in the sinking of HMS Hampshire by a mine off the coast of Orkney, while on a mission to Russia in the company of Earl Kitchener of Khartoum. The Deputy Director of Ordnance Stores still retained the right to place extracts for amounts less than £250, sending copies to the War Office and the Ministry of Munitions. And the Ministry agreed to this procedure on the understanding that such extracts would be for urgent stores, stipulating only that CSOF should first be asked whether he could execute the order. The Admiralty and the Department of the Director of Fortifications and Works also continued to place their extracts on Woolwich independently through their normal agents. Later on, to avoid the difficulties inherent in 2 departments giving separate filling orders to the Royal Arsenal, a weekly meeting was held between the Admiralty and representatives of the Gun Ammunition Filling Department, when the Woolwich programme was arranged. The relations between the ordnance factories and the ministry thus became for all practical purposes the same as those between the ministry and any large armament firm, CSOF, acting as a general manager and deciding what orders could be accepted. Until the Ministry of Munitions finally assumed control of the ordnance factories at Woolwich, the filling factories were supplied with components by the Army and Naval Ordnance Departments. This arrangement cut across the policy of the ministry, whereby it assumed responsibility for all stores till they were finally completed. So in January 1916, it was arranged that CSOF, represented by the Controller of Ammunition Components, should take over all the stores and buildings, all components in stock, the staff in charge of the stores, and some of the office staff who had previously carried out this part of the duties of the DDoS, Woolwich. From that time onwards, the Army Ordnance Department was concerned only with the receipt, storage, and issue of finished stores. The former arrangement still held good for naval stores, empty shell passing on arrival at the Royal Arsenal into the charge of the Naval Armament Store Officer, and being distributed by him for filling, and passing again under his authority when filled. CM7 was informed of the main items of work going through the Royal Arsenal. The supply officers of the Ministry corresponded direct with the factories on matters concerning the particular store in which they were concerned. This arrangement secured a fairly unified headquarter control, though the Consultative Committee on Management was entirely abortive. In November 1916, however, the work of CM7 was discontinued, and all correspondence relating to manufacture, supply and inspection was carried on direct between the department concerned and CSOF through the Ministry's central registry. With regard to extracts, each department minuted CSOF direct, giving particulars of the extract which they wished to have issued. The extract was then prepared and returned by CSOF, if the order could be accepted. Sir Charles Ellis, Director General of Ordnance Supply, was nominated to deal with any matters of importance which might be brought before him by the supply departments or CSOF, and continued to exercise this function until the formation of the Munitions Council, when this responsibility passed to Sir Glyn West as member of Council G. With the disappearance of CM7, all centralised administration of the ordnance factories ceased. There was no one branch within the Ministry to which CSOF could look for guidance or advice in general matters, and there was no one at headquarters in London with a complete knowledge of all the productive activities of all the factories, and able to advise on the nature and amount of work which could be undertaken there in future. The member of council concerned had no one to whom he could delegate the work of dealing with the mass of detailed correspondence which flowed in a never-ending stream in both directions between Woolwich and London. It was a stupid arrangement which lasted for nearly 18 months, until Sir James Stephenson, who succeeded Sir Glyn West early in 1918, pointed out its unsatisfactory nature, and suggested the appointment of a controller of ordnance factories who should be responsible to him, as council member. Sir James considered it no function of a member of council to deal with the details which arrived at headquarters from Woolwich, until they had been sifted, so that only questions of policy which required a decision need be forwarded to him. By this time, with the war nearing its end, the productive capacity of the country for the manufacture of munitions had reached such a pitch of development that more weight than had hitherto been possible could be given to questions of economic and efficient production. A plan was under consideration for decentralizing the manufacturing work of the ordnance factories to the new national factories, which had sprung up around the countryside, and the whole question was referred by the Minister of Munitions to a committee of inquiry under the chairmanship of the Right Honourable T. Mackinnon Wood, with the following terms of reference, and to inquire into and report upon the control, administrative organisation, layout and equipment of the ordnance factories at Woolwich, and the nature and distribution of the work carried on in them and at the arsenal generally, and to advise the Minister of Munitions what, if any, changes are required. The committee should have due regard to the importance of efficient and economic production, and the necessity for maintaining a reserve of productive power, and should give weight to the obligations of the government as an employer, to ensure the best possible industrial and housing conditions of the employees. This committee, which was appointed during the latter part of the war, produced 4 reports. These will be considered in the following chapter. It has already been pointed out that the recommendations of the Haddon Committee on the costs of ordnance factory production still lacked, in many cases, complete implementation by August 1914, with the result that much condemned machinery was in situ at the outbreak of hostilities. The concentration of shops recommended by this committee also affected little, the same shops in some cases having to be rebuilt on the same sites after the war had commenced. The size of the nucleus establishment fixed for Woolwich had been based on the estimated requirements of a moderate expansion commensurate with the demands considered likely to be made in the event of war. As it happened, the preparations made proved quite inadequate, for no one had the imagination and foresight to think in large enough terms. This was perhaps not surprising, since a world war engulfing the majority of nations of the earth had never been envisaged. The vast expansion required in August 1914, therefore, imposed an intolerable strain. The measure of such an expansion may be gauged from the fact that before mid to September 1914, The ordnance factories had completed more work for the Navy than the Board of Admiralty had considered probable during the first 6 months of an anticipated war, in which all the land and sea forces of the Empire would be engaged. The unsatisfactory layout at Woolwich was one of the most potent factors in delaying rapid expansion. During its long history, the Royal Arsenal had grown piecemeal in a haphazard fashion without any central planning. Many of the shops were literally museum pieces, unadapted for modern plant, badly lighted and ill-ventilated. Archaic and out of date, they had grown by accretion like some monstrous coral. The 3 original factories, snug within their own walls, had once been surrounded by a green belt, but insufficient space had been allowed for their development. No blame for this state of affairs can be attached to our ancestors in the early 18th century, for they could hardly have been expected to realize the follies which their descendants in the 20th century would commit. Eventually bursting their own boundaries, these factories had encroached upon each other's territory, with the result that ordered progress was impossible. The efficient siting of new shops required during the First World War became difficult, if not unachievable. And the congestion which increased as the tide of war advanced, made economic management, more and more, a Herculean task. Other legacies inherited from the past added to the disadvantages of the ordnance factories in meeting the crushing demands made upon them at the outbreak of the First World War. Their general design, or lack of it, prevented development on well-ordered lines, cramped building initiative, and involved traffic congestion as soon as mobilization was ordered. Much of the machinery was out of date. The size of the staff was too small to ensure efficient management of the factories when working at full pressure, and no proper provision existed for a reserve of foremen. The exceptionally favorable conditions already promised to employees militated against economical production, and the concessions granted during the war only made matters worse in this respect. Finally, the established routine in regard to accounting was not an ideal check upon contractors' costs, nor did it afford a comparison with those of the new national factories. The old policy, as before stated, was to add to existing shops wherever there was room. It soon became impossible to site a building in the correct position, compared with other shops, or with regard to transport facilities. A new workshop just had to be erected where space could be found, and as this formless enlargement went on year after year, there grew up an accumulation of unsuitable buildings grouped in the most inconvenient places for manufacturing purposes, and a congestion of the western area so great that transport difficulties made economic production impossible. These troubles had not been so apparent with the small numbers employed in peacetime, but after war broke out, they increased 100-fold. The policy of keeping shops confined to the western end of the arsenal continued after hostilities began, chiefly because none of the schemes of extension was sufficiently grandiose to warrant breaking new ground eastwards on the marshes, where the swampy nature of the soil presented serious foundation problems. Extensions were made to the Royal Gun and Carriage factories, the shell factories and inspection buildings, but these only made confusion worse confounded, and added to the density of the area. It was only some of the larger projects, such as the small arm ammunition factories, new fuse factories, and later the new gun factory, QFCF, and the woodworking departments which were moved into more open ground. In these cases, it was possible to obtain a good layout which resulted in greater ease and economy of working. Further accommodation was required in the danger buildings soon after the outbreak of war, and this was provided by cramming extra buildings into existing enclosures with its concomitant chance of greater fire risks. The railways in the Royal Arsenal, like the buildings, had been laid out in a haphazard fashion, and though they served their purpose reasonably well in peace time, they soon proved inadequate to meet the demands made on them by war. The development of transport in the arsenal is considered in Appendix 12, but the difficulties encountered during the First World War may be outlined. Part of these difficulties lay in the two-gauge system, narrow and standard, and in many parts the permanent way was combined. The objections to this combined gauge were apparent before the war, and when traffic increased, the system became very hard to work where the double track was required to accommodate 4 lines, one up and one down for each gauge. The mileage at the beginning of the war was approximately 90 miles, to which during the war were added 44 miles of standard gauge and 15 miles of 18-inch gauge. 13 miles of new roads were constructed. The unsatisfactory layout of the buildings contributed in no small measure to the congestion of traffic, since it entailed an amount of haulage which would have been unnecessary in a modern factory. Components were often carried during manufacture to one or two stores which were widely separated. At one time, a large amount of traffic, mainly stores for DDoS, was being sent into the Royal Arsenal merely for issue and accounting purposes, but this was stopped early in the war. When the Ministry of Munitions assumed control at Woolwich, the traffic congestion had nearly reached saturation point. Something had to be done, and the difficulties were largely resolved by rearranging inter-departmental traffic and increasing the loading and unloading staff. Expansion in the Royal Gun and Carriage factories took place in 3 stages. The first on the outbreak of war, the second on the formation of the Ministry of Munitions, and the third at the beginning of 1917. The first demands from the front were for BL-60 PDR and QF-18 PDR guns, QF 4.5-inch howitzers, carriages and vehicles of all descriptions. Later, heavier ordnance was required, particularly BL 6-inch Mark 7 guns on travelling carriages and 8-inch howitzers converted from 6-inch guns. This original expansion was not very extensive because the space available was very limited. The most important move was the taking over of a large 2-storied inspection building and converting it into a light machine shop for site work. Little could be done in regard to the woodworking shops. There was no room for extension, and the pressure of work became phenomenal. The inconvenient position of the sawmills on Frog Island added to the general malaise, being accessible only by a single-line railway bridge with an equally narrow outlet. Work at this time was seriously prejudiced by the breakdown of certain antiquated machinery, a large proportion of which wheezed to its virtual end, in an endeavour to cope with a load greatly beyond its powers. This meant uneconomic repair or replacement. The gun factory on the whole was able to keep abreast of the demands made upon it during the early phases of the war, but the carriage department tended to sink under the strain and had to call for assistance on the trade in the production of simpler parts of mountings. Luckily, this course was rendered feasible by the fact that jigs and gauges for almost all the items were available for supply to firms undertaking manufacture. The second expansion in the Royal Gun and Carriage factories occurred in 1915, and was caused by the increased demands for 8-inch Mark 6 howitzers, 60 PDRs, 4.5-inch howitzers and their carriages. The carriage department, having no room to extend, had still to rely on the private manufacturer to meet the new demands. At the same time, it had to supply a large number of stampings for the new Royal Laboratory Fuse factory. And to meet this order, a large amount of additional stamping plant was installed in Num. 2 factory, which worked exclusively for the Royal Laboratory. In the gun factory, 2 stores were turned into machine shops, though they were most unsuitable for the purpose. And machinery was set up in every atom of available space in existing workshops. The third expansion in 1917 was caused chiefly by the large number of 18 PDR and other guns, which were returned from overseas for repair, and by the great demand for guns to arm merchant ships. It was by now realized that tinkering with old buildings would be useless for the purpose, and that a bold plan for new and up-to-date shops was essential. The nettle, being at last seen in its proper perspective, was firmly grasped. At the end of 1916, it was decided to erect new shops for the gun factory on the site of the existing timber sheds, part of which had to be demolished owing to a fire, and to remove the timber sheds to a more suitable site on the marshes. On the spot thus left vacant, a machine shop, forge and tempering shop were erected. This plant was designed to deal with the repair of 250 18 PDR guns, and to make 50 new 4-inch guns for the Navy per month. The construction work was begun in February 1917. Part of the machine shop was at work by October 1917, and the whole was completed in February 1918. Later on, the sawmills were removed from Frog Island, and rebuilt in their present position on the marshes adjacent to the new timber sheds. At the same time, new wheelers, carpenters, wood machinery shops, drying houses and stores were erected east of Griffin Manor Way, thus concentrating the whole of the woodwork department in one group. The cost of this reorganisation was approximately £1,150,000.10. Shell filling was concentrated in the Royal Arsenal until the spring of 1915, and the filling factories at Woolwich filled. by far the largest proportion of ammunition issued, until the national filling factories started up in the summer of 1916. The demands for filling and completing ammunition and components on the outbreak of war were staggering, and large extensions to the Royal Laboratory became essential. The total area added to that department was 1,520,572 square feet. The filling capacity of Woolwich was considerably in excess of its output of empty ammunition and components. And, within the first week of the war, the melt plant, which normally filled 10,000 lb weekly, and had never dealt with more than 30,000 lb a week, increased its output, by the adoption of night shifts and overtime, to 100,000 lb a week. This plant was at first used solely for lyddite, which was the recognized HE filling, in August 1914. Lyddite, however, did not hold pride of place for long. Great developments in the use of high explosive made necessary the provision of TNT filling sections, and 2 of these came into operation in April 1915, though the second was not actually completed till the following September. The lyddite plant had also been extended, and the ultimate capacity of the melt plant for both types of explosive was estimated in July at 200,000 lb weekly. In the summer of 1915, 3 presses were installed to deal with 80/20ths amatol, then used for filling 18 PDR shell, and by the end of the year the plant was large enough for dealing with 35,000 round 18 PDR or 13 PDR shell weekly. The melt capacity was then 450,000 lb per week. In September 1917, an old lyddite factory was converted for the purpose of filling naval ammunition with shellite, this method of filling having been worked out at Woolwich. The heavy pressure on the filling factories during the first 2 years of the First World War led to many additions to the danger buildings, and a corresponding increase in the number of expense magazines which served not only the ordnance factories themselves, but also the riverside factories which were engaged in the task of completing ammunition. Full consideration of safety precautions had to be abandoned, and it was considered that for a temporary expansion, the increased risk was justifiable as a war risk. The magazines were placed mainly at a distance on the Erith marshes and at Chislehurst, where the caves had been taken over and adapted for the storage of explosives early in the war. Nevertheless, the question of danger at Woolwich, which had been troubling the authorities prior to the war, became a source of considerable anxiety during the years 1914 to 1918. Explosives in vast quantities were stored on account of the Superintendent of Ordnance Stores, the Deputy Director of Ordnance Stores, the Superintendent of Research, as well as for the use of the filling factories, and the works of riverside contractors. The place was literally a powder mine. Of the 172 buildings which existed at the end of the war, each containing over a ton of explosive, only 15 of them complied with magazine regulations and those issued by the Home Office governing the distances which should be preserved between magazines and other danger buildings, and between these and private dwellings. There were 30 magazines and other buildings containing no less than 3,562 tons of explosives situated within a 100 yards of the river embankment, and in many cases the distance was considerably less. A serious explosion might well have been followed by the flooding of the marshes. The small expense stores, many of which were unprotected by traverses or other adequate safeguards, were very close to sheds in which large numbers of men worked. These afforded a special risk of danger. A fire in a shed next to a store containing 15 tons of HE blistered the paint on the store's walls, and it is a point worth recording that the employees in the immediate locality, instead of fleeing in the face of danger, bravely entered the store and removed the heavy boxes containing explosive from the walls to the center of the building. But general safety precautions were excellent, and it was owing to the care with which they were followed, and to the great knowledge of the managerial staff concerning the nature of explosives, that Woolwich was immune from serious explosions during the war. In this respect, the Royal Arsenal was lucky in receiving few bombs in the First World War. Air raids, of course, had not reached the fine art they did in the Second World War, though they did in fact take place in 1917 and 1918. Only 6 bombs were dropped. During the war, the factories in the Royal Arsenal were shut down 66 times, 29 times on account of Zeppelins, and 37 times on account of aeroplanes. The total time lost was 149 hours, 44 minutes. The combination hooter was installed in August 1917. The bombs dropped consisted of 5 incendiary and 1 HE. They fell as follows. Incendiary bombs. 3 in front of the hospital. 1 through the roof and upper floor of the new machine shop lying between the hospital extension and the main machine shop of the carriage department. 1 in number 5 street outside that building. The fires caused by these bombs were quickly extinguished by the men in the shop under the direction of the night assistant foreman. No damage was done to the machines and little to the building itself. HE bomb. 1 fell on the main machine shop of the carriage department on the south side, and burst either on a roof girder or on a jib crane. The jib crane and a boring machine were destroyed, and some rolls and 4 planing machines were damaged. The roof of the building in the garrison erector's shop received considerable damage, and the crane in that shop was put out of use. 9 men were injured, of whom 1 Jeffreys subsequently died. The total casualties therefore were 1 dead and 8 injured. A great part of the difficulties in regard to surplus explosives arose from the fact that a large amount of filled ammunition had to be stored at Woolwich, in default of any suitable accommodation elsewhere. It was not found possible to take any effective steps to mitigate this state of affairs for some time, as the effects on production would have been too serious, but steps were taken to reduce this danger during the last months of the war. From the beginning of the war, the capacity of the Royal Laboratory for filling components was barely able to keep pace with the demands. Though extensive additions were made, expansion took place in the primer branch, cannon cartridge buildings, QF cartridge factories and in the cap and detonator factory, which entailed incidentally a large increase in magazine accommodation. 3 separate extensions to deal with fuses, gains and minor components were begun in May, June and July 1915. New plant for a weekly output of 40,000 cases, 50,000 number, 83 fuses, 16,000 primers and 43,000 friction tubes was completed in the summer of 1916. The extensions for filling both shell and components which were carried out during the latter half of 1915, included the erection of a new cartridge filling and assembly factory to double existing capacity. The extensions were designed to deal with the assembly of 100,018 PDR shells weekly, either shrapnel or block filled. For the increased output of small ammunition, extensions were also necessary. In September 1914, an increase of at least 5 million rounds a week was required, and sanction was obtained to erect a new factory, CF, and purchase new plant for this purpose, as well as for plant for increasing the output of fuses and cartridge cases. In March 1915, a proposal was put forward for a new factory working up to an output of 8 million rounds a week. The work was taken in hand in April 1915, the factory being accommodated in certain existing buildings formerly in the occupation of the Deputy Director Ordnance Services, and the Chief Inspector, Woolwich, in order to meet the heavy demands for inch Mark 7th ammunition which eventuated in the spring of 1916. A new factory with a capacity of 6 million rounds weekly was built at Woolwich in the May of that year under the name of GCF, afterwards changed to CF. The Royal Laboratory gauge shops were extended in August 1916 by the addition of a large new building. The main building projects in the Royal Arsenal during the First World War were as follows. August 1914, additions to proof butts and magazines. September 1914, additions to inspection buildings for SA and shell, to buildings for filling HE, shell, and to the Royal Gun and Carriage Factory for field artillery equipment. Erection of a new SA factory, a new cannon cordite cartridge range of new buildings for HE filling. Erection of a new shell and metal case factory. Conversion of Chislehurst caves as magazines. Erection of storage sheds on the football ground, and of hutments for 50 married workers at Plumstead. October to November 1914. Extensions to RL Danger buildings, March 1915. 2 new underground 250-ton HE magazines at Berber and large storehouses, April 1915. The expansion of Army Ordnance Department stores as a new SAA factory. The erection of new AOD storehouses on the marshes, the erection of the 200-ton crane. May 1915, additions to fuse and gain filling shops in the danger buildings. June 1915, new bomb and grenade stores. July the erection of a new case and fuse factory, the extension of shops for painting and examining shell. August new naval magazines. September R. Additions to inspection and proof buildings, the erection hutments. October R. The erection of a large new factory for assembling QF ammunition, additions to the proof butts and railway sidings, the erection of 4 200-ton cordite magazines. December R. Additions to buildings for receiving and examining fuses, on erection of new hostels and additional hutments. January R. Additions to naval stores, Royal Arsenal dining rooms, and to CF3 for making Japanese ammunition. February R. The erection of 2 storehouses for components. April R. Extensions to filling and chemical shell factories, and to TT-proof butts, an additional heavy gun gantry, new hostels for women. May R. The erection of a new SAA factory, additions to police quarters. June R. Additional accommodation for the Eye Inspection Department, new buildings for gun inspection, new Tom House, net powder magazine. July R. Additions to SAA factory. August R. Extensions to tailors' paper and leather shops, extension to chemical department laboratory, new women's hostel. September R. Additions to gun inspection buildings, to the research department, and to the experimental signals establishment, new gauge shops, new storage depot. October R. Additional storage accommodation and bond stores, additional accommodation at railway sidings, and a new Rave halt, an additional dining room for women. November R. A new telephone exchange, a new inspection building, new landing stages and ferry, additions to the Royal Gun and Carriage factories, addition to dining rooms in the Royal Dockyard. December 19 R. Extensions to shell store. January 19 R. Additional inspection offices, a new store and a dining room at the Royal Dockyard. February 1917. Extension to proof ranges, the light gun factory. March 1917. Extension of chemical shell factory, provision of electrical furnaces and connecting mains. April R. Extension to the research department, a new dining room for boys. May 19 R. Cloakroom accommodation at SAA factory. June 1917 New dining room, offices and shops for the Director of Inspection Optical Stores. July 1917. New offices for the Inspection and Army Ordnance Departments. August 1917. Extensions to the Research Department. September 1917. Rebuilding store at QFCF4, extension of empty shell sheds, a new shellite factory in the cartridge case factory. October R. Extensions to signals experimental establishment. November IG. New battery room at the Royal Dockyard, reconstruction of storehouse B37. December 1917. Conversion of HE buildings for amatol filling, new furnaces for destroying cartridges, a new building for breaking down enemy ammunition. During RI7, the erection of new sawmills, timber sheds, woodworking shops and stores on the marshes. January I-98. A new shed for returned ammunition, additions to shifting house accommodation for TNT workers, and to accommodation for eye inspection and storage of naval components. February 1 I-98, a foul drainage system for the magazine area. J. E. Larkelzy 1918. A new dining room at the research department, new heating installation for Army Ordnance Department stores. October R-18. Extensions for Arnatol filling, new buildings for cleaning cartridge cases. The supply or labor for the above building services was difficult throughout the whole period of the war, both as regards quality and quantity. Men were scarce owing to the enormous expansion of the armed forces. The difficulty was partly met by employing military labor, and navvies from Ireland. Building materials were also hard to obtain. A great deal of the constructional work in the Royal Arsenal had always been carried out by direct labor, for the conditions under which it had to be performed made the arrangements of contracts virtually impossible. This was particularly the case on work connected with danger buildings. During the war, the employment or direct labor was found to lead to the more speedy results, because details could be arranged as work proceeded. Contract labor would have been cheaper, but it would have led to delay because of the necessity of preparing detailed plans before contracts could have been placed. Expansion took place in LL. The ordnance factories immediately war broke out. The actual area of extensions being the total for the whole of the Royal Arsenal, which included the other departments as well as the factories, reached a gross total of 3,433,609 square feet. The ordnance factories worked to their full limit during the war, though only a few of their most important activities, illustrating their success or failure in fulfilling their functions as a war reserve, can be noticed. The work of the filling factories at Woolwich between August 1914 and December 1915 was of outstanding importance. The filling of all HE shell for the land service and of about half the requirements for the Royal Navy was being carried out at Woolwich when hostilities commenced. The remainder of naval HE shell filling was done at naval ordnance depots, but as these soon became so occupied with repair work, little filling could be done there, and the Admiralty became more and more dependent on the ordnance factories. Woolwich also undertook the filling, assembling and finishing of large quantities of empty shell produced by the trade, and did the greater proportion of the filling of components and fuses, though some of these required by the land service were filled by the trade. Picric acid, or lyddite as it became known when melted, was the standard high explosive used in all classes of shell in 1914, and reliance was placed on the Royal Arsenal alone for the melt filling with this explosive. When TNT was adopted in October 1914 as a substitute for filling the larger types of shell, it proved possible to adapt the melt plant for meeting this change. Woolwich, therefore, continued to perform all HE filling till the spring of 1915, though in August 1914 the ordnance factories were capable of making nearly every warlike store then recognized. Picric acid was an exception, and, as it proved, rather a serious one. Before the First World War, all supplies of picric acid came from private contractors, so the entire program for filling HE shell rested ultimately on the trade. A reserve of 150,000 lb. Of this material was held in reserve at the ordnance factories on behalf of the Royal Navy, but there were no special stocks to meet the small requirements of the Army. Soon after the war broke out, the demand for land service, HE shell soared and field equipments rapidly changed over as quickly as possible, from shrapnel to high explosive. It had been assumed, wrongly as it happened, that large quantities could be obtained from trade sources at very short notice, but, when the demand came following the outbreak, it was found that the private firms concerned were incapable of carrying out this allotted task. By October 1914, the increased use of high explosive made it necessary to augment supplies by the erection of national plant, which, however, were not taken over by ordnance factories, the chief superintendent considering quite rightly that they were already completely occupied. The manufacture of HE in bulk, therefore, never came to Woolwich. Another very valuable aspect of Woolwich work during the war was the production of many special or experimental stores required in small quantities only. Of particular importance was the work of the Royal Laboratory in producing small arm ammunition. The design and supply of this ammunition was one of the most difficult problems of the war, and it was largely due to the untiring efforts of the RL staff that the technical hurdles were cleared and supplies placed on a satisfactory footing. In the early days of the war, Woolwich supplied the only available tracer and armor-piercing ammunition, and the original types proving unsuitable for service requirements. Much research, the greater part of which was done in the RL, had to be carried out before satisfactory patterns could be evolved. Owing to the numerous manufacturing difficulties which the production of these stores entailed, supplies from private firms were unreliable, and the Royal Laboratory had to undertake the manufacture of all types, and that factory often saved the situation when deliveries from contractors failed. Some of the new weapons evolved during the war, such as tanks, mechanical transport, and certain naval stores were never manufactured at Woolwich, as it was found that they could be produced more conveniently elsewhere. The assembling of chemical shell was only undertaken for a short time. For certain stores, the ordnance factories were the only sources of supply for the first few months of the war. The only grenade used by the Army was the RL percussion grenade, which was manufactured solely at the Royal Laboratory till June 1915. And even after that date, Woolwich still remained the only maker and filler of the detonator. Although prior to the war, armament firms had supplied their own shop gauges, Woolwich alone manufactured inspection gauges. After the outbreak of war, although output from the ordnance factories doubled and even trebled, their production was unable to meet the demand, and by the middle of 1915 gauge requirements had increased far beyond the capacity of the Royal Arsenal to supply them. Contracts had already been very widely placed by the Chief Inspector Woolwich, before the Gauge Department at the Ministry of Munitions was formed. After gauge supply had been organised by that department, Woolwich still continued to supply all its own gauges, and a considerable proportion of those required by the Gauge Department. Throughout the whole of the First World War, the Woolwich factories were called upon to act as a balancer in making good the failure of deliveries from other sources, or to meet sudden urgent demands from the front. During the first 2 years of the war, this adjusting process was in frequent request, the Chief Superintendent of Ordnance Factories being advised, almost daily by the War Office, of the articles to be pushed forward, and of those to be deferred to make way for the former. Woolwich was depended on equally by the Ministry of Munitions in the same way, and complete unanimity reigned as to the efficient manner in which the ordnance factories responded to the demands thus made upon them. In meeting those emergency orders, Woolwich was greatly assisted by its proximity to the inspection department, from which it could often obtain drawings at a few minutes' notice. Notable instances occurred in the autumn of 1917, when the filling and assembly shops worked continuously through air raids to assemble the ammunition required for the air defence of London, and again, in March 1918, when the same was done to meet the army demands for ammunition to stem the final German onslaught. There can be no doubt that Woolwich fulfilled its promises of production in a way that no other supplier of armament stores did, and when it is remembered that normal output, particularly of ammunition, was constantly disturbed by urgent demands for specialized stores, and that the attention of the expert staff was largely engrossed in the development of design, the steady output of small arm ammunition from the Royal Laboratory tends to give the lie to the charge of bad organization. On the other hand, labour costs at Woolwich were undoubtedly high, owing in the main to circumstances over which the management had no control. It must ever be remembered that the factories at Woolwich were not run for economy but as a policy of insurance. Everything tended to increase unduly the costs of production in the ordnance factories, uneconomical running in order to maintain a reserve potential, bad layout, congested shops, an overburdened traffic system, the upkeep in peacetime of a large amount of idle machinery, the employment of skilled men on operations which elsewhere would be deemed semi-skilled, the nature of their output, the constant interruptions in their flow of production, pensions and gratuity schemes, free hospital and medical attention, and short working hours. It is rather remarkable that one of the features most often criticized, viz., the adoption of a normal 48-hour week, was afterwards accepted as current practice throughout the country. The ordnance factories were sometimes accused of die-hard conservatism, of undue deliberation in accepting new processes. Such a criticism ignored the fact that Woolwich was an adjusting factory liable to constant changes of program without notice, and that some proposals, which were generally accepted as improvements, could not be applied to it. Such developments could only be justified and accepted in works where a continuous run of work over a long period could be guaranteed. These conditions never have obtained at Woolwich, either in peace or war, and probably never will. On the other hand, the ordnance factories did in many instances adopt labour-saving devices and improved processes from other factories, but the general practice was to abstain from changes in process or machinery without adequate trial, and this position was justified in many cases by the failure of machines or processes after having given early promise of success, such as primer filling machine used at Cardinalde. There can be little doubt, however, that munitions supply would have benefited if there had been a greater measure of freedom between the ordnance factories and the newly established national factories. The position at Woolwich during the First World War has been aptly summed up as follows: the work Woolwich has undertaken has been largely of a character too unpopular for the private manufacturer to consider, or of such an experimental character as to preclude any opportunity for economical production being given to the management. It is clear that the orders which Woolwich has executed have been nearly always in the nature of either experimental or panic demands, the essence of these contracts being not economical production, but to bring the experiments to quick finality and speedy delivery of the goods to the fighting line regardless of cost. Closely integrated with manufacture is the underlying design, and the demand for design with its consequential experimental work increased to a very marked degree during the early days of the war. So, unfortunately, did the demand for increased supplies, with the result that the latter, being the soldiers' professional tools, tended to overshadow experiments at Woolwich. At the beginning of 1916, therefore, it was suggested by Brigadier General W. St. G. Bland, President of the Ordnance Committee, that in order to meet this difficulty, the staff connected with experimental work at the ordnance factories should be entirely separated from that connected with output, and from all other routine duties in the Royal Arsenal. A superintendent of design was therefore appointed to watch the interests of design and experimental work, as opposed to that of output and supply. He took over all the duties of the chief superintendent of ordnance factories with regard to design, and was an ex officio member of the Ordnance Committee. He had a staff of designing officers, and controlled the 3 departmental drawing offices, and was responsible for the manufacture of experimental stores. The suggestion was put forward that the superintendent of design with his staff should be located in London, but after due consideration, it was decided that the drawing offices must remain in close contact with manufacture, so that the officers responsible for drawings could see the original stores being made, and alter the design if necessary, to facilitate workmanship during the initial production of trial stores. The advisability of trying out all stores thoroughly and placing them on a manufacturing basis, before ordering from the trade, was a well-defined policy at Woolwich. For it was held that any original delays which might occur as the result of careful preliminary tests, were justified by the ultimate economy in eliminating alterations during manufacture. The exigencies of wartime production did not always allow strict adherence to this policy, though it was adopted when practicable. This form of playing for safety sometimes drew upon the Royal Arsenal accusations of obstructing designs initiated elsewhere. Instances of this policy occurred in the development of the supply of trench warfare stores. From October 1914 to June 1915, the ordnance factories and Messrs. Vickers were the only producers of trench mortars. Manufacture of the 2-inch trench mortar, which had been designed at Woolwich, was confined to the ordnance factories on account of defects in design which were only gradually overcome. For the same reason, the 4-inch trench mortar ammunition was made solely at the Royal Laboratory until April 1916. The congestion at Woolwich during the first 6 months of 1915 led CSOF to place sub-contracts for trench warfare weapons with the trade, and as these became simplified, more and more reliance was placed on private firms, until by the end of 1916, all work on mortars and their ammunition had been withdrawn from Woolwich. On the same principle, the filling of smoke and star shell was undertaken at the ordnance factories on the ground that it was research work, and needed careful watching. Insufficient allowance had been made in pre-war arrangements for the expansion of the ordnance factory drawing offices on the outbreak of war. There was a sudden large demand for drawings to guide the trade, both for naval and military orders. The Admiralty was entirely dependent on Woolwich for drawings, and the drawing offices soon became swamped with work, the difficulty being increased by the number of amendments required to the drawings, and by the need of subdividing designs to spread manufacture. Amendments had to be agreed to between the drawing offices and the inspection department which sealed the drawings, and this often led to considerable delay. Administratively, the drawing offices still remained under the superintendents of the different factories after the post of superintendent of design had been created, and in the Royal Gun Factory the superintendent still initiated gun design, in which he had considerable experience. Design in the carriage department was undertaken by 3 of his assistants, all military officers, one of whom was a specialist in gun mountings. In the Royal Laboratory Drawing Office, the superintendent of design placed a number of officers, and the superintendent of the laboratory, whose administrative work was particularly heavy, had no responsibility for design. As the war progressed, the design of munitions became to a certain extent decentralized. The dependence of the Ordnance Board, as it then was, upon Woolwich experience during the first 18 months of the war was very great, but with the formation within the Ministry of Munitions of branches such as the Trench Warfare Research and the Chemical Research Departments, provided other expert advisors for the newly constituted Ordnance Committee, and decreased the responsibility of CSOF for new designs. Already in May 1915, the delay in obtaining drawings had caused the Admiralty to set up a drawing office at headquarters, which, while originally intended to deal with drawings, was greatly extended to include much design work of a simple character. More complicated designs and matters involving prolonged research were still to be referred to CSOF and the Ordnance Committee. After the establishment of the national factories, a certain amount of research work was carried out by them. As the war progressed, a gradual division of design work took place between the ordnance factories and the trade. The Royal Laboratory retained its importance in shell and fuse design, owing to its long experience. Experimental work on fuses was continuous, a shop specially maintained for this work being always fully occupied. It was the province of the Director General of Munitions Design at the Ministry, to consult the supply departments with a view to checking economy and the availability of material, the object of the Superintendent of Design and the Ordnance Committee being rather to obtain the best store, irrespective of cost. It seems doubtful whether the question of cost was given due consideration in Woolwich design. It has been stated that when commercial firms entered the munitions market, they were much hampered by the unpractical nature of some of the designs which emanated from the armament firms and from the ordnance factories. For instance, the designs might show square corners, instead of corners capable of being dealt with, without any conspicuous machining process. In the early days of the war, some fuses, designed at Woolwich, had a 14-inch thread, and were of bastard sizes so that no jigs or gauges were available for their manufacture. In this respect it should be noted that the very circumstances which made the ordnance factories the home of experimental manufacture, prevented any great importance being assigned to repetition work, since the factories were specially equipped to deal with small-scale production to a fluid design. One branch of design remained peculiar to Woolwich throughout the war, namely the execution of repairs involving design work. The utility of Woolwich in this connection was very great. The gun factory was regarded as an expert advisor in such matters both for the Army and the Navy, and this special branch of the work accounted for a large proportion of the work of the shops. In fulfilling its role as the reservoir of experience, Woolwich was seriously handicapped by past political action. This aspect of the ordnance factories had not been entirely overlooked before the war, but no special provision had been made for carrying out the duties connected with it. The necessity of maintaining a staff surplus to the actual requirements of the minimum cadre had been clearly recognized in 1907, but the need for evangelist work among potential armament firms on the part of Woolwich foremen and inspectors does not appear to have been foreseen, probably for the reason that the recruiting of new firms into munitions production was not at that time anticipated. After 1909, the staff was reduced to such a degree as to paralyze the actual needs of the ordnance factories themselves, when expansion did take place. During the winter of 1914 to 1915, when the question of extending the area of supply became so pressingly urgent, it was arranged, on Lord Kitchener's instructions, that representatives of firms undertaking the making of munitions should be allowed to visit the shops at Woolwich, inspect the whole process of manufacture and receive whatever information and advice they needed. This threw an added burden onto the already overworked managers and foremen, so it was decided by CSOF that these visitors should be passed through the mechanical engineering department, where a small staff had been trained for the special purpose of taking these firms' representatives round the factories and solving their difficulties. Instruction sheets were also printed giving details of the various operations in the manufacture of 13 PDR and 18 PDR shrapnel, and other shell and their cartridge cases. A more or less regularized procedure was then adopted under which firms were invited to send representatives to Woolwich to see the actual operations, but the numbers had necessarily to be limited. In this way, from May 1915 to January 1917, upwards of 1,500 visitors, representing many hundreds of firms, visited the mechanical engineering department alone, while many others interested only in guns and carriages went to the Royal Gun and Carriage factories direct. While national filling and projectile factories were being established throughout the country, the ordnance factories at Woolwich did good work in instructing the managing staff in their new duties. In addition, the Ordnance College at Woolwich was thrown open for their use. The best tribute to the achievements of the ordnance factories in the way of output during the war is to be found in the figures of their production. The output was large in quantity, varied in character, and reliable in quality, and the striking increases which took place between 1914 and 1916 are the best memorial to the manner in which the factories fulfilled the purposes for which they were designed. While their miscellaneous production was among the most noteworthy of their efforts, it is most difficult to estimate, by reason of its diversity. Over 10 million items of various kinds were produced in the Royal Gun and Carriage factories. The secondary stores made by the Royal Laboratory ranged from classes of which the output was less than 100, to the various kinds of shell components, which amounted in the aggregate to nearly 31 million. In addition, the sum of the miscellaneous articles supplied by the Royal Laboratory approached 300 million. The total bulk output from the factories in the Royal Arsenal during the war was, in addition to millions upon millions of miscellaneous articles such as grenades, tubes, primers, detonators, etc. The most striking feature about the output during the war was its extraordinary diversity. Throughout the war, the specialized skill and machinery at Woolwich were invaluable, both for producing experimental and special types in small quantities, and for meeting particularly urgent demands. Plant was subjected to constant changes to meet these requirements, and continuity of output was almost unknown. Almost every kind of ammunition and its various components were manufactured at Woolwich, and the filling factories had to deal with some bewildering variety: lyddite, TNT, fulminate of mercury, gun cotton, shellite, explosive for explosive bullets, and for a short time, chemical shell. It was not unusual for the factories to have 300 items on the weekly program, whereas 30 or 40 would be quite a large number for a national factory. The Royal Gun and Carriage factories were at times dealing with 20 different types of guns. Woolwich programs were also constantly liable to dislocation on account of the adjusting function which the ordnance factories had to perform in the general supply arrangements. Special instructions to hasten certain orders at the expense of others were constantly being received throughout the whole period of the war. But the adjusting function was particularly frequent in the early years, before the supply of munitions became organized and co-ordinated. Experimental and special orders continued without a break for Woolwich, with its experienced staff, and close touch with the research department, experimental establishment at Shoeburyness, Ordnance Committee and Inspection Department, was unique for this work, and its concentration in the Royal Arsenal avoided dislocation in the national factories, which were turning out stores in bulk on a repetition basis. Another special task was repair work. Damaged guns, which required repairs of a difficult or intricate nature, were subjected to a special examination and report, and the experience thereby gained was often of value in subsequent design. Until the spring of 1915 all HE shell were filled in the filling factories at Woolwich, and the greater part of such a filling program was continued there till April 1916, when the national filling factories were able to take over a good deal of the load. The output of small arm ammunition increased from 28,750,000 rounds in the August to December 1914 period, to 284 million rounds in 1915, and 418 million rounds in 1916. While the output of cartridges made by the trade and filled at Woolwich was about 803,000 during August to December 1914, over 4,250,000 in 1915, and 9 million in 1916. The Ministry of Munitions remained dependent on Woolwich throughout the war for filling certain heavy gun shell and cartridges, for all shell and complete rounds required for proof of fuses and practice, for the bulk ammunition requirements for anti-aircraft purposes, for the filling of base percussion fuses, and for certain special primers and tubes. By the end of the war, however, the ordnance factories were filling only about 7 or 8% of the land service requirements of complete gun ammunition. On the other hand, the Admiralty depended on Woolwich for practically the whole of its filling during the war. During the first 18 months of the war, the Woolwich output of shell and components represented a large percentage of the total. The output of empty shell increased from 124,562 in the August-December 1914 period to 1,218,997 in 1915, and 1,749,577 in 1916, when the output reached a maximum. The empty shell filled at Woolwich reached a maximum figure of 6,810,103 in the same year. At the end of the war, the shell supply from the Royal Arsenal for the land service was comparatively small. The cartridge case supply was 15% of the total, though in certain special natures it was 50% of the whole. For fuse manufacture, Woolwich capacity was about 5% of the whole. Output was chiefly concentrated on fuses NOS and 44, and in respect of these natures represented about 40% of the total capacity of the country. The gun program at Woolwich, as regards land service guns after 1916, was a varying and diminishing one. The extent to which the Ministry of Munitions relied on the Royal Gun and Carriage Factories for guns depended greatly on Admiralty requirements, and it was often necessary for the Admiralty to absorb productive capacity normally available for the Army, which then had to be transferred to other factories. The Admiralty had a preference for Woolwich since their demands were usually of an urgent nature. Moreover, practically all new naval guns were Woolwich designed. Roughly 75% of gun designs prepared in the gun factory were for the naval service, the remainder being divided between the land service and the Royal Air Force. The expansion during the first 2 years of war was very rapid. From August to December 1914, 126 guns were produced, chiefly BL 6-inch Mark 7th, QF 3-inch 20 hundredweights, QF 18 PDR, and QF 4.5-inch howitzer. The total figure for 1915 was 694, of which a large number were QF 18 PDR and QF 4.5-inch howitzer. In 1916, 931 guns were made, mainly BL 60 PAR, QF 3-inch 20 hundredweights, and QF 4.5-inch howitzers. A further expansion took place in 1918, after the extension of the gun factory, of which the greater number were QF guns of various types. In addition to the 4,326 new guns produced during the war, a number of trench howitzers were manufactured during 1915 and 1916. And repairs and conversions accounted for the large total of 5,434, which has already been given in the preceding table. The miscellaneous output of the gun factory formed a large item in its general production program, and varied from important components, such as breech blocks, pinions and aiming rifles, to such small parts as springs, washers, keys and levers. The production of the carriage department included, besides gun carriages and limbers, carts, wagons and travelling kitchens. The expansion during 1915 was enormous, the issues increasing from 1,388 during the last 5 months of 1914 to 7,769 in 1915. In 1916, the output of new carriages dropped to 4,939 and decreased. During 1917 and 1918, the carriage department being largely occupied with repair work during these years. The total of carriages, limbers, gun mountings, carts and wagons repaired in 1917 was 6,066 out of a total of 9,528 during the whole of the war period. The total of miscellaneous productions turned out in the carriage department during the whole war amounted to 8,985,925 items. Shortly before the world was plunged into war, the chief superintendent of ordnance factories had been ordered to reduce staff to an absolute minimum. As a result, the shop numbers reached such a low level that it was hardly possible to function even in peacetime. The rule ordering the discharge of lads at the age of 18, unless work could be definitely guaranteed for them when they reached the age of 21, and replacing them by men who would otherwise be discharged on reduction, only aggravated the problem. The unfortunate arsenal in these circumstances was forced to rid itself of most of the youth it had been so assiduously training, including half the trade lads, whom it relied on for its future foremen. One consequence was that men were engaged on jobs which could well have been done by women or boys. When the First World War did break out, great difficulty was experienced in obtaining suitably trained young men. Such technicians were in great demand in the armament firms, and the limited prospects of promotion at Woolwich acted as a deterrent by spurring on the best men to work for private industry. Labour regulations and conditions in the ordnance factories were totally different from those found in any other factory in the kingdom. The rates of wages were based on the London district rates, but the normal working hours were less. A large part of the work was done on piece rates. Prices before the war had been based on small output, and it was found that when production was increased, those rates soared owing to the skill acquired by constant repetition. There was no cure for this situation, as an express understanding of many years forbade the cutting of rates, and this gentleman's agreement was solemnly ratified by the Minister of Munitions in 1915. This effectually prevented any alterations of those rates, excepting by changing the method of manufacture. The position of the ordnance factories in regard to dilution was also unique. The employment of women had been stopped in 1872 for social reasons, and it was not reintroduced till August 1915. Dilution of skilled labor, either by women or unskilled men, was strenuously opposed by skilled workers in the Royal Arsenal, backed up by their union. It was accompanied by great delay. The Amalgamated Society of Engineers refused to entertain the proposal to allow the introduction of semi-skilled men on work now done by fully qualified mechanics, as it is not proved that there is the shortage claimed. The dilution in this particular case was required owing to a shortage of tool fitters. Eventually an arrangement was made in February 1916 between the ordnance factories and the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, whereby in each group of shops the skilled workmen chose representatives to consider with the manager the description of operations on which skilled labor might temporarily be displaced by semi-skilled or unskilled labor, either male or female. This arrangement was to take effect when all substitutes under the scheme for the dilution of skilled labor had been removed from the skilled work to which they had been advanced. The effect of this arrangement was greatly prejudiced by an undertaking given by CSOF, that since the scarcity of skilled labor was the only reason adduced for its dilution, he would remove the unskilled men who had been taken on if skilled men could be brought in from outside sources. Great and on the whole successful efforts were made by the ASE to fulfill this condition, with the result that dilution was seriously retarded, and skilled labor unjustifiably hoarded. Any skilled man set free in one factory could practically demand room for himself in another, where dilutees were working. The progress of dilution was particularly disappointing in the small arm ammunition factories, only 5% of women being employed there on skilled work. In December 1917, and 25% in July 1918, figures which compared very unfavorably with those found in private undertakings. The pre-war policy of cutting numbers to the bone made a large and rapid expansion extremely hard to achieve when war did eventually break out. The work carried out in the ordnance factories was of a highly skilled nature of a particular kind, and insufficient allowance had been made for the staff to train the new entrants, many of whom were mechanics of an inferior grade. When war was declared, night shifts were instituted at once, and principal and assistant foremen had to be found. Since the permanent staff could not be enlarged, all war entrants were temporary, and it was found that the institution of temporary foremen was a failure, as the individuals concerned never really separated themselves from the men, or took up a position comparable to that of the established foreman. Although the rates of wages were those of the London district, the normal working week in the Royal Arsenal was 48 hours, as against 52 or 54 hours found elsewhere. A night shift allowance of time and a half after midnight was paid in addition to overtime, and Sunday work was paid at double rates throughout the whole of the 24 hours. For the first 2 years of the war, the hours worked at Woolwich were extraordinarily long, quite a change from the 48-hour week which had been worked since 1894. In a departmental report dated October 1916-28 the following statements were made. Men have been employed on the shift system on 27 days out of 28. Women, girls and boys have worked on 13 days out of 14. Women have frequently been employed on 7 consecutive night shifts, normally of 12 hours. Men on overtime have sometimes worked up to 96 hours per week, and boys up to 75 hours. Taking into account the comparative shortness of the normal working week, and the overtime allowance rising from time and a quarter to time and a half at the end of 2 hours, it was not surprising that exaggerated accounts of the wages earned by ordnance factory employees obtained circulation. A scrutiny of wages in the Royal Arsenal for the quarter ending July 5, 1918, revealed the fact that out of a total of about 66,600 employees, 427 earned on an average a total of £10 a week or more. Of these, 205 were employed in the gun factory, 119 in the small arm ammunition factories, 52 in the carriage department, and 49 in the East and West laboratory. Dilution of labour at Woolwich began when Sir Vincent Raven was appointed acting chief superintendent in August 1915. Up to that time the pre-war policy of employing boy labour had been continued, but it was found to be inefficient, not only actually as compared with female labour, but on account of the constant turnover of boys, 1,400 having left during the first year of the war. The cartridge machines were worked by boys, and a comparison of the overall efficiency of the various machines used in the operation with the efficiency of the 6 best boys showed a low general rate. During the summer of 1916, men were being released for the army at a rate of about 250 per week. In the Royal Gun and Carriage factories, female labour was not brought in at once, but the gradual dilution was effected by training a very low grade of mechanic for the high-class work demanded in these factories. This method was thought to be preferable to that of introducing women into jobs for which their fitness was questionable. Sir Vincent Raven considered it of primary importance to effect dilution independently of outside intervention, by methods suitable to the peculiarities of the case. During the period in which he was in control at the Royal Arsenal, the absence of strikes had been noticeable though. Situations had frequently arisen which required delicate handling, and he was of the opinion that outside interference might involve very serious consequences. The excellent relations which existed between the authorities and the workers was evidenced by the fact that the Chief Superintendent of Ordnance Factories was accepted as the final arbiter in all questions arising under the dilution agreement. When Sir Vincent Raven took over in August 1915, the total number of employees, including women, in the ordnance factories at Woolwich was 34,000. In November 1916 this figure had risen to 68,000, although 11,000 men had been called to the colours in the meantime, and had been replaced by women. By this time 20,000 women had been engaged. By May 1917, the numbers had swelled to 74,467, including between 25,000 and 26,000 women. Dilution took place principally in the Royal Laboratory, the work in the Royal Gun and Carriage factories being less suitable for female labour. In the small arm ammunition factories the percentage of skilled men was reduced from the pre-war figure of 18.3 to 15.2 in September 1916, and to 10.3 in September 1918-33. The following figures show the dilution effected in the chief factories by August 1918-34. The rapid increase in the number of employees in the ordnance factories during war is shown in the following table. The municipal services at the Royal Arsenal expanded out of recognition as the number of workers grew ever larger. The disposal of refuse and sanitary conditions, generally involving a large increase in the duties of the Building Works Department. Before the war there were few facilities for providing meals, whereas at the conclusion of hostilities there were 72 dining rooms and other short meal buildings in which meals could be served for the use of the 100,000 employees in the factories and the other departments. The Mechanical Engineering Department had, since its formation, taken over the photo printing establishment on February 12, 1912, the boiler shop of the Royal Gun Factory, boiler houses, the men employed on electrical work in the 3 factories and other maintenance duties. On the outbreak of war the enormous demands the department had to meet threw a considerable strain on it, and it expanded to keep pace with output. In October 1914 it was decided to take electric current from the Woolwich Borough Council, and a new substation was erected to take the necessary load. The department carried out much gas and electrical work at outstations, and in the new housing estates set up for arsenal workers. Between April 1915 and March 1917, the pressure increased, and by the latter month the industrial staff rose to 2,522, and 2 more assistant mechanical engineers were added to the establishment. Women drivers were recruited to replace men released to the colours, and these ladies wore chocolate-coloured uniforms with scarlet shoulder straps and badges. A new 1,000-line telephone exchange, afterwards augmented to 1,100 lines, was installed on the roof of the central office. And the working of this exchange, known as the Royal Arsenal Exchange, was assumed by the GPO on June 16, 1917. At the same time an air raid warning siren was established. In March 1917, the MED took over the engine room and staff of the John Heron, a paddle steamer from the Liverpool Wallasey Ferry, and in December 1917 a further paddle steamer was acquired. These were the boats for the Thames ferry service mentioned later on, which carried 1 million passengers annually. The influx of some 60,000 extra workers in the ordnance factories raised pressing problems of housing and transport, and large schemes had to be undertaken to accommodate such numbers and take them to and from their work. Before the war, Woolwich, like most industrial centres, had been overcrowded, and a building scheme had been under consideration. With the importation of this vast quantity of new labour, the pressure on housing became intense, and new and greatly enlarged plans had to be considered. These were complicated by the introduction of thousands of other workmen for the Abbeywood National Filling Factory, the Thames Ammunition Company, the King's Norton Metal Company, and other firms. To meet the housing difficulty, the government decided to erect both permanent and temporary accommodation. The former method was adopted by the War Office, from which the Ministry of Munitions took over a large scheme for permanent houses begun early in 1915. This ministry, mindful of the serious depression which occurred in Woolwich and Erith after the South African War, which led to working class houses remaining vacant, concentrated on the provision of temporary buildings. Attempts were also made to improve transport facilities, so as to import workers from a distance, and extensions were made both to omnibus and train services, while a new ferry greatly facilitated the employment of workers from north of the river. On January 8, 1915, the local government board, the Treasury, the War Office and the Office of Works, acting in concert, decided to embark on a building scheme for permanent houses at Woolwich. The Office of Works took charge of the work and immediately proceeded to acquire the necessary land on the Well Hall estate, between Woolwich and Eltham. At the outset it was intended to erect 1,000 houses, but later, in order to cheapen the scheme, a certain number of flats were substituted, thereby bringing the total number of dwellings to 1,298. The local government board insisted on the best town planning lines, and 12 houses to the acre was adopted as a standard. The houses differed in size. 116 contained 3 bedrooms, a living room, a parlour, an extra room on the ground floor, and a scullery. 357 had the same accommodation less the additional ground floor room, while 613 had 3 bedrooms, a living room and a scullery. The flats, of which there were 212, had each 2 bedrooms, a living room and a scullery. The absence of a bathroom in the best town planning lines of 1915 will be noted. The weekly rents for these houses and flats, fixed on the recommendation of the LCC valuer, were. The governing consideration in this building program was urgency. Work was actually begun on February 1, 1915. About 1,000 dwellings were finished and occupied by September 1915, and December 1915 saw the completion of the project. The Garden City was built in 10 months. This speed of erection was not obtained without corresponding heavy expenditure, and the total net cost of the scheme was approximately £808,000, which worked out at an average of £622 per house or flat, including land, roads, sewers and fences. Though the price was cheap according to present-day ideas, it was considered high at the time. An arrangement was made with the Housing Department of the London County Council, and was in operation during 1917, by which the council managed. The estate on the lines followed on their own estates in return for a remuneration of 4.5 cents per on the gross rentals. At the same time as the Well Hall Garden suburb was started, the government took steps to ensure the rapid erection of 3 temporary hostels for boys, and 50 huts to serve as married quarters at Plumstead. To cope with the never-ending stream of workers, efforts in the first instance were made fully to exploit all local resources. Inquiry made as to the accommodation available in the district under the control of the services resulted in 70 married quarters being taken over from the garrison. A site on which roads and sewers had already been constructed was obtained by the War Office from the London County Council, who had planned a building scheme there and then abandoned it on the outbreak of war. On this ground the Ministry of Munitions planned to erect 350 temporary huts, but investigation showing the site to be low, lying, and broken up by holes and ditches, making any layout difficult without previous filling in, eventually only 125 huts were constructed. Married quarters were also set up on the Corbett estate, Eltham, and in October 1915, Treasury sanction was sought for another 1,500 huts and several hostels. By December 1915, expenditure up to £345,000 for huts, and £41,275 for hostels had been authorised. This provided for 1,500 huts at £230 each, 5 boys and 10 women's hostels each accommodating 100 persons, and an experimental hostel for men. Although plans had been sanctioned and accommodation was underway, the housing situation at Woolwich in the spring of 1916 was reported to be almost hopeless. Scores of men drafted into work threw up their jobs after a week or two because they could find nowhere to live, while in May 1916, when attempts were made to shorten the hours in the ordnance factories, it was found impossible to introduce the 8-hour 3-shift system for women, as suggested by the Hours of Labour Committee, because the lack of housing space prevented the importation of sufficient women. During the summer of 1916, building operations were hurried on and matters improved. By the end of that year, under the temporary schemes initiated by the War Office and those instituted by the Ministry of Munitions, there were already erected, or in course of erection, 7 estates of about 2,700 temporary bungalows at Woolwich, Greenwich and Eltham, hostels for 300 boys opened by the War Office, and others for 500 boys, 1,000 women and 100 men under construction by the Ministry of Munitions, to be placed, when finished, under the charge of Lady Henry Grosvenor. Later extensions were made to the latter, and further hostels were opened for men, so that by 1917, when the Royal Arsenal employed 74,467 workers, of whom over 25,000 were women, between 3,000 and 4,000 men, women and boys were provided for in this manner. Bungalows were also built on the Well Hall estate, on the Churchfield estate, on a site in Plumstead owned by Queen's College, Oxford, on the LCC site at Greenwich, on the Corbett and Bostall estates at Eltham and Abbey Wood, and at East Wickham, Lodge Lane and Shepherd S Farm, the sites in each case being either loaned to the Ministry of Munitions or acquired under the Defence of the Realm Act. Practically all the huts at Woolwich consisted of 5 rooms, a living room, a scullery and 3 bedrooms. In some cases there were bathrooms. The question of rents formed the subject of prolonged negotiations between the Treasury and CSOF early in 1915, before the plans passed under the Ministry's control. 3 different bases were proposed: the rents of houses with similar accommodation in the locality, a fair return on capital outlay, and the maximum readily obtainable. The Chief Superintendent urged the last as the only practicable course, since the whole object of the building programme had been to induce men to come into the district and work in the ordnance factories, and these would be unwilling to pay more than 5 seconds, or 6 seconds, a week. The actual cost of each hut worked out at the then unusually high figure of £325, owing to abnormal conditions and rapidity of construction. Thus, calculating on a 20 years' life at 4%, the rental should have been 19 seconds weekly, while the economic return on 70% only of the cutlay which the Treasury required would make the figure 15 seconds. In May 1915, the Treasury fixed the rents at 9 seconds, 6d, and iOS, a week which, during the year 1917 to 1918, brought a return of 2% on the capital outlay. By August 1918, all the huts available were occupied at these rates. Some of these hostels were placed under the direct control of the Arsenal Welfare Supervision Department, as this facilitated smooth working as regards the allocation of separate wings to the different shifts to ensure quiet for sleep and similar details. Others were leased either to local committees, or to organisations such as the YMCA with a special agreement guaranteeing their use as hostels for Royal Arsenal workers. For example, in the case of the boys' hostels, the lessee undertook to use the building for ordnance factory boys, only to be responsible for the physical care and disciplinary control of the boys, and to provide medical treatment when required. The Chief Superintendent of Ordnance Factories supplied the equipment and paid the rates and taxes, while the lessee paid 15% per week rent for every person in the building. The total charge to the boy was not to exceed 12 seconds a week, but subject to these conditions, the lessee made all the arrangements for management and service. The hostel charges made to women for rent was is 3d, 2 is 9d a week according to the class of accommodation provided, while men were charged 1 second, 6d a week. The houses and bungalow huts were far more satisfactory than hostels from the economic standpoint, and gave rise to little anxiety, until after hostilities had ceased. The huts were not so rapidly occupied as the permanent houses during 19,161,917, and slack periods of letting were experienced after the air raid of August 1916, and the bad weather later on in the year. Reports on the bungalows showing the numbers occupied each week indicated that they fluctuated between 1916 and 1918, being high in summer and low in winter, when the huts had a tendency to become damp and cold. In some cases, lack of permanent ventilation or inferior timber added to the discomfort of the inhabitants. The worst estate for letting in 1916 was the Corbett estate, the whole of which was low, lying, and 20 minutes' walk from the tram and the nearest shops. The municipal services, policing, scavenging, garbage collecting and fire protection, etc. For all the estates were undertaken by the Woolwich Borough Council. The huts therefore were subject to rates. The roads, as a rule, were in a very poor state, as they were only constructed for temporary use, and suffered in consequence from the effects of heavy traffic. The success of the hostels varied considerably, some proving immensely popular, while others were never used to their full capacity. The most successful year of their administration was from March 1917 to March 1918, when the maximum number was housed. The fact that it was impossible to keep the hostels fully occupied caused them to be run at a substantial loss. For instance, the St. George's Hostel for Boys, which had shown a profit up to March 1918, produced a deficit during the succeeding 9 months, owing to the arsenal policy of replacing boys by women and girls. After the war, these losses tended to increase. The approximate costs of the hostels for 100 inmates were £2,350 for men and boys, and £2,600 for women. The hostel administration staff consisted of a superintendent, wardens and a matron. The superintendent was a whole-time employee, or alternatively an ordnance factory official. He was responsible for the admission of tenants, and for their expulsion if found undesirable, all personal relations with tenants, the maintenance of reasonable discipline and the collection of rents. He was assisted by 2 or 3 wardens whose services were recognized by partial free board and lodging. The matron was a full-time employee responsible for the domestic arrangements, maids, cleaning, bed-making and laundry. She was dependent on the superintendent and wardens for the maintenance of discipline. Meals were served in the hostel canteen, which was open early enough in the morning to allow men going on first shift to obtain their breakfast till 10 o'clock at night. The canteen was managed by the Ordnance Factory Catering Organisation, prices and services being similar to those in the Royal Arsenal canteens. The recreation room, run by the men's own committee, was provided by the establishment. There were no rules. Tenants could come in and go out at whatever hour they pleased. All that was asked was a decent standard of conduct. The accommodation available was, rooms were plainly furnished with bedsteads, built-in cupboards, chests of drawers, washing sets and ditty boxes. Cleaning, bed linen, bed-making and towels were included in the weekly rent. Personal laundry was normally arranged individually between the tenants and the ward maids. Having housed or attempted to house all the extra workers, the other pressing problem was to bring them to their workbenches. The rapid expansion in numbers combined with double shifts taxed the existing transport services to the utmost. Towards the end of 1915, shifts were revised and hours were staggered in the hope of mitigating some of the worst troubles. This for a few months did ease the strain, but the additional labor required in the spring of 1916 called for more drastic measures. New omnibus services were immediately instituted, and together with those already in existence, were strengthened from time to time, so that by the signing of the armistice, there were upwards of 300 buses running in the Woolwich area for the conveyance of employees to and from the Royal Arsenal. The increase in tramway services was more difficult to put into effect. There were 3 lengths of single line in the centre of the town which acted as a bottleneck, and it became evident that further development could only come by doubling the track. After some delay caused by protracted negotiations with the Woolwich Borough Council and the LCC, this was carried out. The revised tramway service, providing an increase in cars of 15% between 5 a.m. and 9 a.m., and of 27% between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m., came into operation in July 1917. The provision of an additional ferry service across the Thames proved a great asset. Not only did it relieve congestion on trams and buses, but it saved several thousand workers at least 40 minutes' journey each way daily. The question was taken up in August 1916, and in March 1917 the service started. It was a case of history repeating itself after 100 years. Though the passengers in the 20th century were civilians, the ferry was established in practically the same place as the old military ferry, and ran between a site on the north bank near Galleons railway station, to a point directly opposite in the Royal Arsenal. The Arsenal authorities operated this ferry, and apart from its valuable service in maintaining output, it brought in a weekly revenue of approximately £160. Expansion of output being of top priority. After the outbreak of the war in August 1914, the staff of the cost accounting branch was depleted to strengthen that of the pay office, and of the more vital stores and wages branches. Ascertaining costs became a secondary consideration, as it always does in war, the first and overwhelming one being the acquisition of victory. At the end of the financial year 1914-15, it proved, somewhat naturally, impossible to close down the factories for stock-taking, thus undermining the whole structure of the system, and rendering it impossible to build up the annual account in its correct form. The question was therefore referred to the Treasury, who intimated that all they required during the duration of the war was an interim statement of expenditure, with an approximate division of the charges against each service, India, and the various colonies involved. They did stipulate, however, that a comprehensive stock-taking should be undertaken at the close of the financial year, succeeding the termination of the war, and one complete account produced showing the actual cost of production of each type of article manufactured during the war. In pursuance of this ruling, the Woolwich Accounts Branch booked expenditure currently against the several orders, and by estimating did arrive at the approximate cost. Owing to the delay, however, in obtaining prices of materials, accurate costing was out of the question. Various information was, nonetheless, supplied to the different superintendents at their request. For example, weekly labor costs, machinery rates, day work and tool percentages and non-production percentage, or the estimated cost of any particular store periodically, so that the variation in price could be watched. Any periodic estimate of prices for all articles was simply not possible, on account of the inadequacy of the staff. Overheads and non-productive charges were, however, watched separately, and records were sent to the factories. The weekly report of the work takers also afforded CSOF, a means of detecting any abnormal prices, or unusual development in factory costs. The controller, small arm ammunition factories, watched efficiency indirectly by records obtained in the shops, relating to output, machine efficiency, stores consumption, tool consumption, and numbers employed. Similarly, the controller of filling factories watched efficiency by checking the quantities of material used with that estimated, by watching output, rejections and tool consumption. Ultimately, however, the preparation of a detailed production account for the whole period of the war was abandoned on the ground that the information obtained would be of little use for comparison with pre-war rates or post-war costs. Expense. Weekly progress returns were instituted in the ordnance factories in April 1916. The statistical record of output posted in the shops aroused much interest among the men, and fired their ardor to improve efficiency. They also enabled the management to detect at once the cause of any drop in output. Mr. Eric Geddes, who inquired into the organization of the ordnance factories at Woolwich, as they stood when the Ministry of Munitions assumed control, recommended that, in view of the temporary nature of that control, the costing system and accounts should not be disturbed. It should also be realized that during the First World War considerable fluctuations in current costs would have excited no particular remark, as rush jobs entailing overtime and night work were a common occurrence. The evolution of a system of costing over short periods, giving comparative statistical information to the management, and the establishment of such systems in the new national factories, gave rise to a demand for similar costing figures from Woolwich for purposes of comparison. At the end of 1917, the question was discussed within the Ministry of the desirability of reorganizing the system at Woolwich, in order to obtain results comparable with ministry costs. Two experienced accountants, by whom the subject was investigated, were unanimous in their view that the advantage of modernizing the method would not compensate for the loss of output that such a change would engender. The existing system could have been adapted to provide monthly costs of production, had it been possible to take stock in the shops at the end of each month. Since this would have placed an intolerable burden on the shoulders of foremen, the matter was dropped. In the summer of 1918, however, the manufacture of munitions had reached such a high level that consideration of questions of efficient and economic production became possible, and the absence of an adequate current costing system in the ordnance factories became the subject of much adverse criticism. On the one hand, the Ministry of Munitions was anxious to obtain manufacturing costs at Woolwich along lines similar to those in force in the national factories, so that judgments of economy in allocating capacity could be made, and contractors' prices be checked. On the other, the management of the ordnance factories, had it not been engaged up to the hilt in producing the munitions so urgently required, was tied by past legislation to a system which differed in form from that established by the Ministry. This could only be changed by the Treasury acting in concert with the Comptroller and Auditor General and the Public Accounts Committee. At the time it was considered well-nigh impossible to graft the Ministry's system on the current method of ordnance factory accounting, without seriously increasing expense. Consequently, nothing was done till the war had been over for some time. The concentration in the Woolwich area of all the thousands of workers, men, women and boys, who were brought into the neighbourhood to swell the munitions programme, required a welfare department to look after their interests, listen to their troubles, and keep them fit and efficient for their heavy labours. Special difficulties in this immense task early raised their heads. There was the labour problem involved by the high standard and varied nature of the work undertaken in an overcrowded area, and the maintenance of the supply of skilled workmen in face of the policy of dilution adopted, and the claims of military service. The welfare department at Woolwich was entrusted with the work of badging and badging skilled arsenal operators, the enforcement of the schedule of protected occupations, and of the Military Service Acts, the employment of war munition volunteers, and the conduct of cases before munitions tribunals. Housing and transport have already been discussed, but other matters affected the daily lives of the workers. Canteens were provided partly by private enterprise, but increasingly by the welfare department. The drill hall of the 2nd London Brigade RFA, situated in Beresford Street, was used as a men's dining room in 1916. It had been fitted up by the YMCA who ran it. It could accommodate 1,500 persons, and the meals, which were served continuously day and night, totaled about 4,000 per 24 hours. Much canteen accommodation was provided in 1916 and 1917. In 1916, a women's dining room in the Danger Buildings near the Fuse branch, to accommodate 1,350 persons at a sitting, was approved at a cost of £1,935. The Flagstaff dining room for 800 women was sanctioned, and a new dining room to seat 300 men at a cost of £1,080 was approved in the MSO area. In 1917, an additional dining room for 1,500 women in the old Danger Building area at a cost of £6,400 was approved. 38 and sanction was given to build a dining room to accommodate 1,000 boys at a cost of £7,585. For those who worked in the area of cartridge factories, number 2 and 439. Later on, in 1918, increased dining room and cloak room accommodation was sanctioned for CAC employees working in stores F&F, at a cost of PS 1245.40. In 1917 there were 3 principal systems of control of the canteens under the Chief Superintendent of Ordnance Factories, control by a committee of workers, control by the YMCA, and control by the Woolwich Arsenal Welfare Supervision Department. Under there were 4 dining rooms seating 2,550 men, a survival of pre-war conditions. Under there were 7 dining rooms seating 1,500 men, and 5,700 women. The YMCA worked under an agreement and were subject to the Chief Superintendent of Ordnance Factories. In such canteens the workers appointed a committee whose business it was to communicate to the YMCA, should any matter arise requiring amendment in the administration of the canteen, or satisfaction not obtained from the YMCA, the committee had a right of appeal through the superintendent of their department to CSOF, whose decision was final. In addition to this, a welfare superintendent was always on duty in the dining rooms at the principal mealtimes to receive complaints and to report direct to CSOF any incidents of note or points which required attention. Under the Welfare Supervision Department controlled over 20 dining rooms and 14 coffee stalls, with a total seating capacity for 4,950 men, LL, women and 2,200 boys. These dining rooms were similarly served by committees of the workers, and were attended by welfare supervisors. The total dining accommodation in the ordnance factories at Woolwich was then for 9,000 men, 16 GU women, and 2,200 boys, a grand total of 28 LU workers. This was in addition to the dining room in the drill hall previously mentioned. Since 2 shifts were normally worked in the factories, this meant that 56,200 employees could be given meals in the 24 hours. Early in L9R8, the canteens supplied some 80,000 to 90,000 meals daily. Their takings were £1,000 a day. They employed 1,000 workers, and their supply depot issued daily between 20 and 25 tons of foodstuffs. The canteens opened latterly by the welfare department were carefully planned on modern lines, and gave quick and efficient service. The very long hours of work in the ordnance factories during the early days of the war have already been mentioned. They were caused by the heavy demand for output from the factory workshops, with their special equipment of experienced workmen and machinery, and by the congestion in traffic and housing which made it impossible to substitute 3 8-hour for 2 12-hour shifts in the 24 hours. These excessive hours were, however, the subject of vigorous protests by the health of munitions workers and the hours of labour committees in the course of 1916, and, from the late autumn of that year, the overtime and the weekly number of shifts per worker were shortened, though they remained heavy compared to those in the many controlled establishments. Sunday work for women was abolished during 1917, and at the end of that year the Sunday shift as a whole was cancelled. A special section of the welfare department was set up to deal with the welfare of the 6,000 to 7,000 boys on whom the effects of very long hours, high earnings and repetition work without, in many cases, any industrial prospects, bore heavily. In what spare time they did manage to obtain in the 24 hours, they tended to behave like young Turks. Sometimes their high spirits were almost irrepressible and resulted in trouble. 6 special welfare supervisors for boys were appointed, and efforts were made both to reduce the number of boys employed on unskilled work by the substitution of women, and to diminish the bad effects of long journeys superimposed on the day's work by refusing to engage those boys who lived more than an hour's journey from the Royal Arsenal, and by offering some amenities such as a summer camp and evening clubs. Boys, however, under the abnormal conditions under which they lived, showed little marked predilection for ordinary clubs. They required something more exciting. There was heavy wastage and frequent changes in the boys employed. Between the outbreak of war and the armistice, 24,000 boys had been placed in the ordnance factories by the Woolwich Employment Exchange, which, in 1 year, imported over 1,100 boys from 100 distant exchanges. The welfare of women and girls workers was provided on a very large scale, and, on the whole, under better conditions than the similar work for boys, because women workers and many of the processes on which they were employed were practically new to the ordnance factories in 1916, and fresh accommodation obviously had to be provided for them. Miss Lillian Barker was appointed Lady Superintendent in the ordnance factories at Woolwich in December 1915, and at the date of her appointment the number of women and girls working in the Royal Arsenal was in the neighbourhood of 500. From that time onwards the strength of women workers increased enormously till at the time of the armistice 27,000 were employed. One of the most important considerations throughout her work was the selection of the women. Practically every aspirant for female labour was interviewed by Miss Barker personally, and workers were encouraged to come to her or to their welfare supervisor when in difficulties. It was important also that the right woman should be selected for the right job. The medical examination determined whether a woman was fit physically for her intended employment, but it was necessary also to see that a worker put on to light work, such as fuse making and gauging, had deft and nimble fingers, that machine workers were not too old, and that workers for TNT were steady, healthy women. A similar class of problems also arose at other factories, for instance, at the Royal Small Arms Factory, Enfield Lock, where experience dictated that only blue-eyed persons could become efficient barrel setters. When women were employed, charge hands and group leaders were mostly those promoted from among their fellow workers, for their steady and capable work, but for the more responsible posts, such as principal overseer, or assistant foreman, it was invariably found advisable to select well-educated women with some experience in organizing, who were likely to be popular with the girls and at the same time had the knack of maintaining good discipline. Welfare supervisors, at the rate of 1 for every 1,000 women, were also appointed, and their duties were to ascertain that the comforts provided for the women were utilized. Long fireproof overalls and caps for danger building workers, tunic and trousers for the girls working on trucks where skirts might have hampered their movements, and waterproof garments for those exposed to the weather, were the regulation clothing, and it was the duty of the welfare supervisors to see that these were properly worn and regularly changed. For the general health of the worker, it was necessary to ascertain that every workshop was properly ventilated, that seats were provided for the girls, that there was a break during the morning for light refreshments, that there were a sufficient number of canteens where they could get nourishing food at a reasonable price, and that there was a quiet restroom attached where they could rest after their meals if they so desired. Women working on powders such as TNT were provided with special clothes to wear in the canteen, so as to preclude any danger of contaminating their food. Abundant ablution rooms, cloakrooms and shifting rooms were provided, and were inspected daily by supervisors. Bathrooms were also established where workers on TNT could bathe in factory time, whenever they wished. To provide recreation for women workers, evening classes in conjunction with the LCC were started in such subjects as singing, first aid, home nursing, gymnastics and elocution. Concerts in connection with these classes were held fortnightly at Woolwich in the town hall, and frequent dances and entertainments were given by the girls. Football, hockey, country rambles and other kinds of sport were organised and largely appreciated by the workers, while evening clubs were opened for those who lived near enough to profit by them. Holidays were arranged for both the women workers and their children. This was of great assistance as it was often difficult for a mother to arrange to go with her children and leave her work. There was also a small convalescent home where girls, showing signs of overwork or breakdown, could go for recuperative purposes. The home was used largely as a means of prevention, rather than of cure, and the actual sick were seldom sent there. During the last year of the war, holiday houses were organized, and to each of these a party of girls was taken by the supervisor in charge of the factory in which they worked. Homes for workers' babies were another necessity, and 2 creches for the children of both married and unmarried mothers were started. These were staffed with qualified nurses under the supervision of the Advisory Committee on Women's Employment attached to the Employment Exchange, together with a home for ailing babies and an infant welfare center, inaugurated by the American Red Cross Society. With the signing of the armistice, the duties of the welfare department at Woolwich became more onerous. Meetings were held in all the ordnance factories, at which the women were asked if they could live without working, and if so, to take their discharge immediately. Also those who had a trade, and could return to it, were advised to do so at once. The vacancies occurring in the Army Pay Corps, and for VAD members were announced, and every girl was asked to approach the lady superintendent for advice if she needed it. Numbers of women and girls were put back into domestic service. Lists of suitable advertisements from all the papers were noted each day, and every woman who wanted work, and could not get it for herself, was helped as far as was humanly possible. Widows, particularly those who had lost their husbands before the war and received no pensions, were the first to receive consideration, and the majority of these were placed on salvage and sewing work in the Royal Dockyard. The Royal Arsenal had certainly moved forward since the days when the workers numbered only a few hundreds, and when emigration was the only key to the problem of the discharged.